but I can't read, I can't write, I can't spell, and most of the time I don't know my left from my right.
Now here's the thing about me that's a secret that most people don't know. I'm borderline retarded, and I can't read. These books that you're recommending, Goethe. I would pick that up and I would be like, 10 minutes later, I'd be like, what's my favorite song? The ABCs?
I think we're kind of getting off topic. Can you name 10 books?
Keep going back to me. Can you?
Don't change.
No.
10 books.
You're changing the subject, actually.
10 books.
You're changing the subject,
okay,
actually.
3 books.
Okay. Well, the Game of Thrones series,
It's not a book.
Twilight series. It is a book. It is a book.
Dress your age. Carrying a school bag on stage. What are you doing with a school bag on stage? You can't even read.
Thanks for staying with us, everyone. We started a little bit late this evening. Prude, speak to this.
Oh, of course. We were just having a lovely lecture on the concept of African time, and then, all of a sudden, we lost track of time, which was really fitting. No, so I had a lovely little boomer moment. We were talking about the semantics of historical time cubes and spinal catastrophism. We have to keep all of our memes going at the same time. I had a little boomer moment, and I had one of the little like rubber tips on your earbuds get stuck in my ear as I was readjusting, and it was not coming out. I had to go grab a pair of tweezers and go to my fiance and have her pull it out. Because I was like, oh wow, this is one of those like weird firsts where you've been doing this shit for years, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, that's never happened before, and here we are.
I think you can tell a lot about a man's character by how he chooses to remedy that situation. What tool do you go for? Do you do the tweezers, or do you grab a vacuum cleaner to suck it out? Or do you try and like tie a string around it? Like, how Wile E. Coyote does a man get? And I think
we went Wile E. Coyote for like 12 minutes before I was like, okay, I have someone who can actually help me pull this out.
This guy decided to go and ask a lady for help, if you can believe that.
What is the point in having a broad if you can't put her to work?
Women, they don't know
it's
how to...
job for a reason, lady.
Women might get spooked if you ask them to do ear stuff. You know what I mean? It's any facial
Come on,
orifice.
I'm not Randy Pitchford. Like, we're not going that far.
Women don't want to know about the ears. They don't want to know about the nose. They barely want to know about the eyes. You know what I mean? That's why women never look you in the eye, if you really think about it. They're horrified. They can't gaze. You know what I mean? Like, they're always
they say the
off.
eye is the window to a man's soul, and inside it doesn't matter who you are, inside the eyes of every man is a little howling mutant just begging to come out.
And the ears are the window to the man's stomach. And women don't want to know what's going on in there, let me tell you. I don't mind telling you.
Which is funny, because every heart surgeon will tell you that a way to a man's heart is through his groin, and women have already known that for millennia, but here we are.
I love medical professionals, and they just have never gotten it right. They've been doing it for millennia. And then you go back, and it's always just everything's wrong. They've never been right. How many times? What do they write about? Surgery's like accidentally right, I feel. If you're getting in people's guts and just moving things around, you're just going to reset. All surgery is a factory reset.
I feel like this is where the God complex comes from. Like, there's a slight inferiority God complex, because it's like that's the only profession where you can actually say, I can rearrange your guts and not get in trouble.
And be surrounded by, terrified women in the operating room.
And not worry about taking prep afterwards.
That's what they prefer. They prefer taking prep. That's where they get the prep. They harvest it. Like, you harvest adrenochrome, where, DMT, it's secreted by the pineal gland. You get prep from the pancreas. That's why they're always going in there. They don't tell you that every surgeon's gay and has AIDS when you're watching House. They can't fit that in there, but, too real.
It's funny because in the United States, one of the highest rates of people taking their own lives per profession is dentists. But at the same time, almost every dentist I know belongs to some kind of Mormon cartel, and I haven't been able to square that circle. And I'm beginning to think to myself, I think that they've got the profession wrong, and maybe it's the faith. I could, I'm just spitballing here.
That's
Just
fucking
spitballing
weird.
ideas.
Dentists are predominantly Mormons, I guess, out where you are, but maybe everywhere. Have you checked?
And a lot of this is based off firsthand experience. So like a lot of people, it's like growing up with like army dentists and things like that, living on post. Almost every army dentist and dental assistant I knew was Mormon or was married to a Mormon. And then when I was in college and when I got out of college and I was working, one of the people I worked with to get a sponsorship from was working at a dental office, and she was like, "Oh yeah, it's a Mormon cartel," and so it's just sort of my, I guess, my own limited concept of the dental industry, where I've just always ran into like ethno-religious cartels running things.
Remember, I don't know if you ever saw this show, but people have seen clips of it. They had that show about a young doctor who has autism.
The Good Doctor.
Yeah, and it features prominently in every scene, it seems like. So what if they did a show like that, but the doctor was just gay and had AIDS. And it was just always brought up.
The Good Proctologist.
The good a proctologist.
One of the reasons why I like this show is that I get to be Geo on this show. I get to be the unhinged retard. For once.
Just there's a guy like pitching that show on Netflix. He's like, he's a proctologist and he's gay and he has AIDS. And then they're just, what's the show? That's not a show. That's not a show. What is it? Like, what's the story? What's the drama?
Ismay would like a word with you, sir.
It does. But he's like, that's all I got. Like, how are you not excited by this? I want tree surgeon here. He says the entire medical profession is literally the leg bones connected to the. That sounds like a Far Side comic, you know. I would actually, that'd be a perfect Far Side comic where it's like a guy doing, like, he's got the operation going, and the last thing the guy sees before he like goes out under the ether is like the leg bones connected. Yeah, just the last thing you hear as you're drifting off and you're falling into the ether, all you hear is him humming. Look at Rich here. Surgeons have an overrepresentation of psychopaths and sociopaths. Can't remember which or if it was both. Let's say it's both. What would you do if your son came to you and said he wanted to be a surgeon? I looked down for my paper. I said, what are you? What are you, queer? What is this? You coming out? What is this? I'd rather you be my daughter.
I would definitely enjoy if my son were to be like, Dad, I'm going to be a surgeon. I'm going to be like, son, where are the squirrels?
Yeah. So where's all the fingernails of your victims?
Do you have blood lines like Dexter?
Okay, so where's the parts? Where's your collection of parts? Let's get this over with.
That's actually something I stole from The Simpsons. Ah, tree surgeon.
Look, son,
you vile villain.
I'm up to date. I've watched the 7th reboot of Dexter. I think I know a thing or two about serial killers. They're still doing that fucking show, by the way. They're still bringing them back. Going? Oh yeah, and there's spin-offs. There's a Dexter expanded universe. I've never watched an episode of Dexter. I watched 15 minutes of the
Dexter
first.
expanded universe, which now includes an episode of Sister Wives for some reason. I think it's really fitting that we have sort of I don't want to call it like a shitpost ebook, but we have like a one-off text where we kind of discuss things that we want to talk about. Like you and I were, before we were live on the air, we were talking about what kind of show we wanted to do after this book, and we seem to alternate between sort of these trendy pop internet or pop politics books. Like we've covered White Fragility, and then the last episode of Dyer we covered the Anti-Memetics book. And so now, but I think that was also really fitting because every time we've covered like sort of the pop culture books, they always hit really hard when we apply some of the more legitimate theory books that I think everyone should be reading. But that's why we're here. We read so you don't have to. And so
it's always like one for them and one for us.
Yeah.
And the one for them is usually some kind of, like you said, sort of a pop politics book. White Fragility is probably the best or most popular episode we ever did, but Enlightenment Now is up there as well. And then the ones for us are the really weird ones. that I enjoy reading, but are very like maybe the ultimate one for us was Anti-Oedipus, because I think some people enjoyed spinal catastrophism. It still gets like people still bring that up to me, but I don't think anyone was really into Anti-Oedipus.
I don't think anyone
us.
was really into the Cyclonopedia one either.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of messages from people.
If
saying,
it were 2007 and we were doing the show, I feel like that would be way more popular.
Yeah, I mean, if we were doing this in 2007, we would be getting a Teal grant right now. We would be way ahead of the curve. We would be.
I would be the perfect age to get a Teal grant. I was like, I don't know, what, 2007? I was like, what, 12?
We'd be at so many parties, we would get tired of seeing Mike Cernovich. You ever hear, you notice that Mike Cernovich, like every time I hear about one of these parties with influencers, like Cernovich is still always there. Like imagine just running into him at every fucking function and, you know, like he corners you and he just won't shut up about like, because he goes through these phases in his life where I bet if you talked to him a few years ago, he would not shut up about how, you know, every actor is a pedophile. And now it's something else. But so I got Sex Freakman here. Look, I can never be sure if I'll write a book. If I do, it can't be claimed to be both a reader and a writer. So I'll be relying on you boys till I'm sure. I don't even know what that means, but I just like Sex Freakman.
Well, that's why we're here. I just like the name.
I like seeing Sex Freakman show up. He's one of our most treasured fools. So we have a very interesting book today that we had both read recently, and this was recommended to me by some friends of mine, some very learned friends. Let me just see if I can pull it up right here. So this is what we are looking at. This is called Futures Past on the Semantics of Historical Time by, I'm going to get this wrong. I'm just letting you know right from the rip. I'm not going to pronounce this right. Reinhart, nailed it. Koselleck. What do you think?
I'm going to go with the first pronunciation. Because if I say Koselleck or Koselleck, I'm going to think of Tom Selleck, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah. So Reinhart Koselleck wrote a book on fucking time, if you can believe it. So where to start with this? We have a lot of notes.
Do you want to start with the man?
Yeah. Do you have anything on the man? Because I don't have anything pulled up in front of me. But what do you have something there?
Well, he is a very prominent historian of the 20th century. He was a German soldier during the Second World War, a member of the Hitler Youth organization inside the German Nazi Party. He was captured by the Soviet Army and was prisoner of war in Kazakhstan, but he came back to Germany after some time, I think for medical reasons. He wrote a great book called, mainly his doctoral thesis, which has been translated into a book for us to read, called Critique and Crisis. And it's heavily, he was heavily influenced by Carl Schmitt. But he, of course, spent a long time writing about history and our understanding of history, and why this book is very important for us to sort of consider. And of course, we have a lot of his, writings are about sort of crises or sort of this idea of the future, which we're going to talk about a lot in this book here, but also the idea of how eschatology or utopianism affects the way that we perceive history and maintain order. And he's considered quite important in the sort of school of German conservative thinkers. The first person on Twitter I can recall telling me to read this book and then maybe read his essays in the most smarmy way possible was Nigel Carlsbad, who's no longer on Twitter. But I know that he had cited him a lot, along with doing some translating work on von Haller. But so I'm glad that we're finally going to cover this.
Yeah, he's been recommended to me before, and that Crisis book was one I wanted to get to as well. But if we do that, we'll cast that off down the line because we have a lot of other things to get to before that. But that's what fascinated me so much about this book, because I hadn't encountered something like this before. Let me just pull up the book again. Sorry, here we go. Yeah, so to put it simply, let's summarize it at the start. We'll summarize it and then we'll kind of get into what we like about it just off the top. It's about history itself. It's about history, but not any particular history. It's about how we view history, how we understand history, and indeed how we understand time. Sort of a meta-analysis of time and how our conceptualization of time has changed across the ages. And in this book, he focuses on, correct me if I'm wrong here, and I don't want to be too vague about it, but it's about how modernity represents a hard demarcation for how we view the past and the future at the same time. So it's really about how modernity has changed how we interface with time. And you can go off in a lot of directions on this. At some point, I'm sure we're going to mention Julian Jaynes. I'm going to mention another book that I've been reading that kind of meshes with this one. But I've been fascinated recently with not time itself, but how you would encounter this phrase, and I've known many people have used this phrase, historical period. They'll say, in this current historical period, for example. And I never really knew what that meant. I had maybe a vague idea of what it meant, but there's this idea that, we live in a period, but what does that mean? Do we live in a century or a year or a decade? I was speaking about this with Thomas 777, who's a friend. I'm sure he's a friend of yours as well. In our very first interview I did with him, this would have been years ago, this came up. And just offhand, we mentioned historical periods because I'd heard, and I'm just providing some context for how I approach this idea. I'd heard some people say that even though, sitting where we are right now in 2025, we have never left the 20th century. That was the assertion. And what does that really mean? That sounds kind of crazy. Thomas had the opposing idea where he said, the 20th century was actually the short century. It wasn't just that 100 years. It was like 25 or 30 years within that century. So there is some debate about where the boundaries of these historical periods are. But there's this idea that we measure time by human actions or by these grand movements that don't fit neatly within the centuries or within the decades. They cross over centuries, and I'm sure this will inspire some conversation or debate about how different historical periods fit together. But that's how I encountered it, and it was an interesting idea because I think, if you grew up if you're like a millennial or a Gen X even, you probably experienced this, I think, artificial phenomenon where you think that in the 20th century, every decade was almost its own branded commoditized item. Like the 60s had a feel, and the 70s had a feel, and the 80s had a feel, right? And so I think that got people used to the idea that, every decade it should be a new style or a new vibe. But how frequently did that happen across time? Were the 1870s much different than the 1840s, right? Or, the 1630s and the 1650s? No, it was just a mid to late 20th century thing. But that really affected how we view time. I think people expected time and style and things to be more neatly ordered by decades. And then reading this book, I think it kind of jailbreaks you from this. It makes you step back from time itself and realize what we really start tracking with movements and stuff, it almost sits on top of time. It's another dimension to time. And that's why the subtitle of this book is The Semantics of Historical Time. So we start with historical time and then we look into how it actually functions. So what do you think about that? Is that a fair summary, or do you have anything to add to that?
The other thing I would add is that Koselleck really emphasizes the transformation, like you said, that it is the demarcation period, but specifically come the early modern era of history. And even when we use those terms to demarcate things, we're speaking from a very specific anthropological lens. And Koselleck kind of concludes the book by arguing that when we look at history, we need to be examining it through an anthropological lens. We need to understand that when we mark history or we say that we make history, we're implicating ourselves in semantic shifts that are really only going to be coming from a specific culture or from a specific group of people, and that universality is not present. And so when looking at that, we have to really conceptualize, as he claims and coins in this phrase, right, conceptual history, that these things are part of sort of the worldview of Weltanschauung of a people or a group or a period of time. And as our technology has changed, especially after the Industrial Revolution, the ability to control things with, say, the concern of the eschaton, whether it be with like the Roman Church, as he spends a great chunk of time at the very beginning of the book, but also the importance of understanding that our ability to think about the future is also severely limited by our own conceptual framework for how history works, and that we need to be aware of that when trying to even talk about history to begin with. So this book, in a lot of ways, is, you could say it's meta, but I think that this is one of the more important texts I've read in 2025.
Yeah, and I've read other authors who have swam in these waters as well, talking about how we view the future and how we in the 20th or 21st century view the future. How could you contrast that against how ancient peoples would have viewed the future, even not stepping into the world of cyclical time or prehistory, really? And was the future something that was drawing you towards it, or something or something apocalyptic? And I remember when we were talking about Charles Cochrane, and there's these other great Christian theologians, about how the concept of the end times has evolved along with us too. Like, how imminent was the future, and was the future imminent because we were expecting the end of days, and was it going to happen in the next 25 years? And that was very significant to the mindset of baby boomers. And there's this great book that I've talked about on my show before called Decadence by Jim Haugen. It's very, very hard to find. I got sent a copy by a listener, and he was a reporter, and we talked about it on this show before too, but so I won't get too deep into it. But as an aside, he was talking about how it was a millenarian idea, which is not just of the 20th century, but it was this idea that the dawning of the millennium, it's going to be, if not the end of the world, then a phase shift, the age of Aquarius, things like that. And so the experience by many baby boomers and even subsequent generations was, the onus is on us to deliver the future. We're taking an active role in achieving the promised land of tomorrow. So the future wasn't just some unknown country. It wasn't just a thing that really has no bearing on your life. The future almost became the only thing. It's a thing that you are pursuing, and that wouldn't be an experience shared by your ancestors. So how did that happen? And it came by degrees. And I don't think that's an experience shared by most of the world. Not to get into the racial politics of it, but I don't, there's a serious fixation on that in the West, but I don't think that same fixation is in India or maybe even China, or certainly not Africa. But I think that's what he doesn't really get into this. He doesn't really, I don't think, take a racial or ethnic look at how this works. And there actually is an argument to be made for that, and I'll get to that a bit later. But I think the subtext here is that this is truly like a Western phenomena as well.
Absolutely. And when you look at the Western phenomenology of, say, how we look at the future, I mean, you don't have to be Christian, but you can see the Christian influence of an eschaton, or even the claims from secular progressives that there will be a sort of judgment day, right? I mean, for the future of the world, right? Like in what you could call late antiquity, or the pre-Renaissance era, or what some people would call like the Dark Ages, right? You have, as what Koselleck mentions in part 1, sort of in the opening parts of the book, for the Roman Church, this unknown eschaton must be understood as one of the Church's integrating factors, enabling its self-constitution as the world and institution. The Church itself is eschatological, which, if you're a Christian, yeah, that's definitely true. The body of Christ exists in sort of this eschatological framework. But when you look at even like progressives looking in towards the future, you also see this as well. I mean, the ongoing claims, especially with climate change, right? Like, this is the most obvious example, from Al Gore to Greta Thunberg. There is this clear implication of not so much fire and brimstone, but this polluted world that is far too gone for us to save, whilst again talking about sort of global or racial or ethnic politics, however you want it, when we're not going to acknowledge the world's largest polluters are not from the first or developed world at all, but they're still integrating this secular eschatology as a historical framework in which to integrate progressive politics into the West, especially since the church has seen its decrease in temporal power.
That's a fantastic assessment there. I just wanted to, before I forget it, as we're explaining this today, we're going to get into his thesis right now. But one thing that he gets to, we're just in part 1 right now. And as I was scanning this, he begins by, he kind of reasserts his thesis throughout. There's a great amount of knowledge and information in this book, but we're going to give you the real meat and potatoes of it. But I like this explanation here, and an interesting way to start thinking about historical time and the role of humans in defining historical time is that of a painting. How the historical time, one way to look at it is that which can be captured, the human events that can be captured. So within a painting, he's describing one here that's capturing a battle scene. And you can tell with that just what one snapshot, you can capture everything there is to know, about, not only about that battle, but the context of the battle, what you might call the vibe of the battle, the historical significance of that battle. You can meditate on that painting, and there's more captured within that one image. And not only, and this is one of the reasons that art is such an interesting zone of interest, because the whole purpose of art, in my view, is to capture that which mechanical means cannot capture. It's trying to capture meaning through a unique human lens, which is why you can get into Impressionism and Cubism and all these styles. But you're trying to capture something that is singularly human, that could only be processed through a human perception. So you can look at historical time like that. It's like, what is the action, the human event that could be captured in just one image that doesn't need to be explained. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to read about it. You can kind of get it. And so that's really what, to me, historical time is. It's like the art of history. I know that's a very pretentious way of saying it, and I probably got in my own way by phrasing it that way, but that was not rehearsed. That wasn't in the notes. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. And I think the other thing too, when it comes to borrowing off like this painting. So I mean the painting that we're talking about in question at the beginning of all this is what's it specifically called?
The paintings is Albrecht Alfdorfer's Alexanderschlacht.
Okay, so the Battle of Alexander. And in the opening we see that the painter for this is consulting with court historians. He's consulting with records and everything there to try and provide a painting of this battle in what he thinks is like a linear way to read it, but also as accurate as historically possible to the numbers of combatants, to the numbers of casualties in the conflict. And he uses this as a way to open up and understand, like, this is a pre-modern understanding of our own historical concepts, because this is meant to be presented more so objective, but also at the same time, as Koselleck points out, like, really this is ideological. But we're trying to be accurate. But in your own accuracy, you're also trying to portray something that is going to be serving as an image or an icon for this particular event, and to do so. And I mean, to crib from McLuhan and Understanding Media, a painting or any kind of photograph or image is sort of a distant early warning system for a culture of what is to come and what is happening to them, whether that's changes in that culture or an illustration that this is now a society that is moving towards victory or ascendancy into power.
Absolutely. And just to give I'm going to get into the thesis here just so people can understand. I'm going to read some sections here.
Go for it.
I'm going to jump around in the pages here, but He says, whoever seeks to form an impression of historical time in everyday life may notice the wrinkles of an old man or the scars in which a former fate is preserved. The conjunction of ruins and rebuilt sites can be recalled, noting the obvious shift in style that lend architectural outlines their deeper temporal dimension. Or one might contemplate the coexistence, correctedness, and hierarchy of variously modernized forms of transport through which, from sleigh to airplane, entire eras meet. Above all, an individual can think of the successive generations in family or in working life, where different spaces of experience overlap and perspectives of the future intersect, inclusive of all the conflicts which they are invested. Even such preliminary observations make clear that the generality of a measurable time based on nature, even if it processes its own history, cannot be transformed unmediated into a historical concept of time. Basically saying the specific measurement of time does not help us understand time itself. We tend to think of the passing of time more functionally. We tend to denote the passing of time through generations, which fall irregularly along, the centuries. So he says here, historical time, if the concept has a specific meaning, is bound up with social and political actions, with concretely acting and suffering human beings and their institutions and organizations. That's really it right there. But interpretation of the relationships arising from these factors immediately transcends temporal determinations derived from natural, physical, or astronomical phenomena. So that was just kind of restating what I had said there, which is that when you talk about time, we talk about revolutions, and the era of revolutions as we know it changes this completely. But we've always had a very human-oriented understanding of time itself. And I think that's the only way we can understand time. We struggle to even visualize or conceptualize time outside of the human context. And that's really what he's focusing on here. And sometimes, especially if you're into science fiction, you'll imagine time as some kind of ethereal slipstream, or maybe you imagined it as some kind of abstracted fourth dimension, but we're wiping all that to the side. Time isn't just a sandbox you can play in. It's not just a realm you can step outside into and then walk around in. Time as we know it emerges from human action. That's what he says here. Historical time is bound up with social and political actions, with the humans centered in them. So that's, to me, I think that's the best starting point to understand what he's talking about. And I think that has more utility to the average person now.
I don't have much to add on that. I would have, so far, so good.
All right, so I'm just going to skip ahead here to page 34. Let me see, is this the right part? So he says, stating my thesis simply, in these centuries there occurs a temporalization of history, at the end of which there is the peculiar form of acceleration which characterizes modernity. And that's what we were just talking about. There's something about the acceleration of time that is unique and distinct to modernity. And even that, like when you say modernity, everyone knows what you mean, but the edges of that are very fuzzy to people. Most people don't know when modernity begins, and you'll encounter debates like, does it start with the Enlightenment, or does it start with the scientific revolution that preceded the Enlightenment, or is it somewhere later? You know what I mean? Like people don't have a consensus on precisely where modernity starts. Most people don't anyway, but we still understand that we are inside of it right now, and there's a pre-modern world which a great many of us are trying to return to. So he continues on here, we are thus concerned with the specificity of the so-called Frühneuzeit, the period in which modernity is formed. And Neuzeit, I believe, just means new time. I've got many German listeners on my show, and I know once they hear this, they'll be typing furiously that I perhaps pronounced that improperly. But the idea of new time. And so, as I said, we're not getting into the weeds on how time was viewed in the 1700s or the 1300s. It's like we're still keenly trained on modernity for the purposes of this book. Sex Freakman here says modernity begins when you become gay. Fair.
That's a good. I mean, sure, why not? You know, all plays well. But I mean, this is the thing, right? This is where, ironically, this portion which we're covering. I don't want to say ironically, but it's a connection I'm making in my mind. So forgive me for the tangent. But when we're all looking for these demarcation points in history, and these are all, of course, based on how we, this book is really going to hammer into you, is how we conceptualize history and the necessity to look at it perhaps through a more anthropological lens. But I'm reminded specifically of Empire is a Way of Life by this new left scholar called William Appleman Williams, who was sort of, he was a very large critic of people like George Kennan. He was part of the sort of Michigan School of International Relations and sort of these new left historical analyses. But he sees the demarcation point for American history as with the closing of the frontier. He sees this as a demarcation point for American influence outside of the continental 48. And he looks at that as like, well, we see that once the frontier closes, like there's only one place to go for this need to Americanize and to expand, which is, of course, towards the Pacific and towards other parts of the world. And he uses this sort of as sort of a soft critique of sort of like this is not as feasible as we think. There are people in Washington think that it is. And at that point in time, he sort of demarcates that, like, as the frontier closes, like we're still looking with hungry, ravenous eyes for more resources and more power. And with this point that we're talking on here, we're also looking for those demarcation points where when do we start perceiving ourselves different? How do we perceive time differently? And I think for Koselleck, I think you get a really good answer, which comes with specifically the French Revolution. And he says it literally on the next page, page 35 for us. He says, let us stop for a moment and look forward over the 300 years whose structural change and temporality is the subject of this essay. On May 10th, 1793, Robespierre, in his famous speech on the Revolutionary Constitution, proclaimed, the time has come to call upon each to realize his own destiny. The progress of human reason laid the basis for this great revolution, and you shall now assume the particular duty of hastening its pace.
Sorry, what page is that again, sir?
35.
Oh, hey, we're on that page. Good.
Yeah. Just towards the end here. He says, Robespierre's providential phraseology cannot hide the fact that compared with our point of departure, there has been an inversion in the horizon of expectation. For Luther, the compression of time is a visible sign that according to God's will, the final judgment is imminent and that the world is about to end. For Robespierre, the acceleration of time is a human task, presaging an epoch of freedom and happiness, the golden future. Both positions, insofar as the French Revolution descended from the Reformation, mark the beginning of the end of our period. Let us try to relate them in terms of the future. And I think that's a really good point here to look at.
Yeah. I think you did a very good job there focusing on, like, what does the end of an era feel like, or what's a good example, like the closing of the West? Because people will say that, like, this is the end of an era. But what does that mean? And a lot, given my mind jumps to, stupidly, of course, mob movies. Like the end of the era of the mob, and that was a short lifespan in America, but it was such a pungent history. It was such a
it ends with history. The Sopranos' controversial finale.
No, it actually does. Like it is that's like the mob in decline, analyzing itself. Like the Sopranos Sopranos literally opens with Tony Soprano musing that he's getting in at the end. He expanded his father's empire beyond what his father could ever imagine, but he will never have what his father had. And it's this is probably digital archipelago type stuff we're talking about right now, but it's the story of America. It's the feeling everyone has that we're in a decline. And the Steven Pinkers of the world and the other secular humanists would say, well, that's dumb. You're a dumb idiot, and you're also crazy for thinking that, because everything's better than it's ever been. The end of history is here, and it's great. And what are you even complaining about? That falls upon deaf ears. The reason why Tony Soprano as a character is so relatable is because he represents this sort of fatigue. And I think like that's... people kind of feel when an era is ending. And I think that's an interesting thought experiment you could get to in the chat. Like, what would the end of this era be? Like, what is this era? How would we define this? Maybe some would define it in political terms. Let's keep this constrained to America. Like the end of the era would be hypothetically, I guess, the fall of or the decline of the American empire. What is the likelihood of that happening? People are predicting a civil war, but short of that happening, would the end of the era be, and I think this is more realistic, the end of the post-war consensus? I think there's a sense on the right that the post-war consensus, and I don't want to get into, World War II stuff here because we got a pretty diverse audience that watches this show, but certain narratives that have been dominant in America in the wake of World War II that have guided, whether cynically or not, foreign affairs, that's going away. People are questioning the post-war consensus. And maybe once that ends, that is the end of the era. Maybe that's the end of the 20th century. That's one way to look at it. And you're more of a geopolitical guy than I am. So what do you think about that?
Well, and again, sort of like with this book, it depends on the framework in which you want to look at the future. I mean, Koselleck kind of makes it very clear that when we try and make predictions about the future, the demarcation that's really come now when looking at what comes next is that we look a lot more structurally at things. The demarcation came that, we're with like Prussian reform that Koselleck cites. We look at the structure of a system rather than this potential utopia that might come next, or these good things. I would note that we've kind of reverted back to that in a lot of ways, where I think in a lot of ways it's maybe due to just our online dick waving. I know it's a terrible term to use, but in a lot of ways we're online because there's this sort of escapism, and it's the one platform in which we can still engage in things, because the era of mass politics, with the exception of maybe what we've seen with the AfD or with Trump or with the Brexit movement, a decade ago, is kind of gone. Although there's still obviously vestiges of that, but it doesn't have the same kind of effect that it once did maybe a century ago. So I mean, when we look at like the predicting the future, I think that we need to look at it structurally. Like, are the powers of the government that we know, are they still going to be around? Maybe on paper, but we can kind of look at other trends like demography or birth rates or the economy and kind of come to the conclusion, okay, so this is maybe not going to hold up as much as we want to. Like, we can't use 200-year-old laws to enforce new things, and that will eventually break at some point because they're just not going to work. We'll see. Clearly, we're still using a clause that applies to freed black slaves from the Civil War to give gays marriage. So who knows, right? Making predictions like that becomes really difficult because you can look at people like George Friedman, for example, strategic forecasting. He wrote a book in 2009 called The Next 100 Years. And I think if you were to look at it, most of it's hot garbage. And I would like to reread it because that was the book that I read in high school that got me super interested in predicting or looking at the world geopolitically. And I kind of stopped doing that as the Prudentialist just because I realized there's so much I don't know, or so many, historical or ethnic bugaboos that I don't want to really step into, that you can inadvertently piss off half of Turkey and half of Greece by commenting on like the Turkey's new naval policy or whatever, right? So I think but to bring it back to this book, I think one of the things too is that you have to look at things structurally. However, when it comes to like geopol, there are different theories. Like, are you like a Wallerstein systems analyst? Are you a neo-realist? Are you a constructivist? So that's like, well, anarchy is what you make of it. So how do you define those terms? And it's something that I think is those kind of semantic remarks in geopolitics are also going to be very much at work on how we perceive history, because what do? Well, we live in an era even worse than that of the printed, word being on a printing press, is that we can get information instantaneously at any point in time. And we engage in this McLuhan-esque auto-amputation when we say things like nothing ever happens, or don't worry, it's priced in, or, things are going to get worse before they get better. Like, these become these thought-terminating, I don't want to say copes or cliches. I mean, they kind of are. because it's very difficult for us to process that information in order to have a new model for how things might go or where they will go based on what I know and what history tells me. And if you say, well, history tells me nothing ever happens, then like you have a very warped view of history. But at the same time, our worldviews shift based on our own semantic nature. Like a really good example of this, and I kind of want to just rip this Band-Aid open. Unless you know exactly, like unless you've read his essays, the semantic framework of Whig history that comes from, say, Curtis Yarvin, right? Like that can mean fucking anything if you don't like. You can take that term and run with it. But if you've read his work, then like you know that he's referring to a particular type of political movement out of England that also had a brief stint in America that would play a role in shaping our politics. And thus we have this sort of temporalized, linear understanding of the future. But if you don't know, like that sort of becomes something that's just in the public noosphere politically. And it becomes this sort of catch-all phrase for the demarcation of like our own version of history. But then if you read things like what the Puritans actually believed in or what they did, like what our friends over the Old Glory Club are doing on the show American Spirits, then like you kind of understand instantly like, oh, well, these guys were way more based than what Yarvin is proposing. So maybe we should read primary sources over a guy's blog. And these sort of dispositions or these methodologies that we take for granted really limit our ability to understand history or maybe make accurate predictions.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout out to American Spirits. We love our Ryan turnip seed. If despite everything you just said, I do want to make a prediction. I think if I had to imagine and speculate wildly on what the end of this current era could involve, I think it could be two things, and these will sound like big swings, but the first would be the death of ideology, or the death of, because to me, ideology is a modern thing. It is a 20th century, cannot fit cleanly within the demands of the 21st century. And this might be the most extreme of all. I think you'll start to see people taking less guidance from history. I think the future we're entering into will be so mind-bendingly unprecedented that we're going to find the way forward cannot even be inspired by much from the past, because so many of us, specifically on the right, are constantly sorting through history to find the wisdom to move forward. And I think that wisdom will be ill-equipped to handle where we have to be going. And we will need to find a solution beyond an ideology, which is, there's interesting ideologies. Everyone has their favorite ideology or the one they think works best, but I think they're all ill-equipped for the various technological revolutions. And as I said, sort of the mind-twisting, third eye shattering stuff that we're going to have to deal with within the next 25 years. That's my view. That to me is what an end of an era could involve. That paradigm shifts so much that ideology is something we look as antiquated to assess where we're going. So anyway.
Well, one of the things that's in part two, and I forgive me for jumping around, but
no, go ahead.
You're mentioning the future and you talk about ideology. He has this whole section in chance and historical writing. It's in part two. I'm on page 150. And this is where we talk about the Wheel of Fate, or Fortuna, right? And so he writes here at the last paragraph, the aesthetic components of historicism forestalled motivational remainder in chance far beyond their once theological bases. Whether historical knowledge was thereby properly served and done so better than in the period at which Fortuna played a part is a question that today must be raised once more. Perhaps it could be shown that it was precisely the abolition of all chance that led to the demands for consistency which were too high. Indeed, because of the abolition of the accidental, chance became absolute within the plane of historical uniqueness. The role of Fortuna, played in a space of prehistoric conception of history, has in modernity become that of ideology, impelled evermore to ever more novel manipulation, the more it assumes the guise of immovable lawfulness. And this is where I think if you wanted to say Whig history, if you want to take a look at like the Fukuyama concept of the end of history, which is predicated in a way based on Marx, but it's also predicated on sort of the end of time as we know it, whether it's in the, if you want to read John's Apocalypse or the Book of Revelation, the things that are borrowed there. And again, these sort of concepts of chance.
Are they ripping off the Bible again, Prude?
Oh, well, yeah, it's going to be there. And we're going to reference it a lot today. Sorry. Hate to be that guy. I hate to sound, well, I'm not going to do the whole church lady bit from SNL, but nevertheless, for here, though, I think that this is the important part is what kind of role does ideology have going forward? Because I think that, when we look at, say, the impact that technologies of previous generations, like, the written word now available in mass media and print. Like there are whole books written about that. You have like the Gutenberg Bible from McLuhan. You have Luhmann's work on media, who's someone I've just begun to read based on some recommendations from friends. But like all of a sudden, like that's brand new. Like now all of a sudden I have this new capable of information, these historical tomes, these translated classical works right in front of me, and I can now have a better understanding of the world, make predictions. Now ideology sort of plays the role of fate. Like we're on the right side of history. My side inevitably wins. The good guys inevitably win over.
I love that term. I was thinking about that a lot.
Oh yeah, when I was reading this, I was thinking about Fukuyama. I was thinking about the apocalypse, and I was thinking about the right side of history because
try going back to a few hundred years and explaining that phrase to someone. I'm on the right side of history. That would seem like such an alien concept to them.
To go back to a book that you and I covered years ago at this point, it's been about 2 years, right? What Went Wrong, the creation and the collapse of the Black Jewish Alliance. I think that's had some of the earliest arguments, which again are also based in either Judaism or Christianity, about the abolition or the maintaining of the institution of slavery. Is this is biblically ordained, or that it is the right side to be on, because the right side of history is to be on God's side. And you notice this especially in the South, more so than anything. I mean, you see this in their own version of the shout, shout, the battle cry of freedom, down with the eagle, up with the cross. That there was clearly the religious theological basis was still there. And only now in modernity do we assign that to an ideological position rather so much as theological, because most people nowadays are not theologically well versed or don't understand the worldview in which these men occupied in, which makes this really interesting when you see sort of the progressive or mainstream conservative. I mean, again, I say progressive, I repeat myself. Sort of Christians argue with more conservative ones on Twitter. Like there was a guy who wrote that essay about traveling across America to gas stations to meet a girl or to find someone, because he took some guy's challenge on Twitter and wrote an essay about it. And he was arguing with someone, and he says, well, if this is your definition of what it means to be saved, is there any Christian from the past, like pre-1965, that is saved in your worldview? And that person could not give an answer to this gentleman, in part because, again, what is the primary motivating factor for history these days is what Koselleck writes here. In modernity, it's ideology. I think we're beginning to see that blur, like your prediction, Dimes, because I think in a lot of ways, our ability to conceive a coherent worldview doesn't really exist when the world is so fundamentally incoherent and schizophrenic, as we've talked about in other books. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, history is being, I mean, we're battling right now an ideology. Yes, rewriting history, like the BBC, right? They're doing all these things to rewrite, like the defending against the Battle of Hastings and the conquest of William the Conqueror. And like all of a sudden there's a black guy fighting and for the Anglo-Saxons. You're like, well, what the fuck is this? But I mean, these things are done purposefully so because they indoctrinate and they allow us to look at that. I mean, this is the reason why when the woke is more correct than the mainstream, when they say, well, this movie wasn't made for you. And I'm like, I know this movie wasn't made for me. This was made for the generation that comes after me and their children, because this is going to predicate their understanding of the worldview, which is why when we live in a post-literate emoji, pictographic society of memes or shorts or videos, which is basically just recorded conversations, not so much actual texts, that now history just becomes, this is the right thing because this is what the culture has been telling me. We've returned to this sort of Volkish understanding, but it's very superficial because it's still predicated on this sort of like consumerist American mindset of like, well, this is what it means. For people like, sorry, I'll wrap up my point here, but like for people like Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier was the great Americanizer because like you either fucking made it or you died or you went back to Europe. Nowadays, like, oh, you can still maintain whatever you want, but keep in mind, America is movies about flaming hot Cheetos and Air Jordans and the guy who founded McDonald's underneath the McDonald's brothers, played by Michael Keaton. Like that's sort of what it's become, and it's this reifying reiteration of what ideology is supposed to mean, which is to be a good consumer and to hold on to what makes you feel good. And historically, that is what it's always been about.
Like,
since
it's not
the last
accurate, but
century.
we don't care, and
Yeah.
we've never really cared. No one seems to really. They understand it's, maybe some would call it propagandistic, but we know it is, heightened in some way, and we also prefer that. You had made an interesting comment there that I just want to talk about before we forget. The idea that, we're talking about being on the right side of history. There's this idea he gets to in the book about the spatialization of time. And you had mentioned that, being on the right side of history is God's judgment. I think a lot of ways, people, I'm using his name because we covered his book before, but Steven Pinker, a lot of the secular humanists probably don't imagine God, but what they do imagine is something like God to them, which is their perfected selves in the future. Like the phrase being on the right side of history, you can say that because you believe you are being sat in judgment. So the future is judging you here in the present, sort of like Rocco's basilisk in a sense. So we've mentioned that so many times on the show, but just to summarize it, it's the belief, sort of like I have no mouth and I must scream. It's the idea that there inevitably will be a super powerful AI in the future, and it will only reward those who helped usher it into existence. And so you should do everything you can to usher it into existence because it is inevitable, and you don't want to end up in some, eternal torture cell where it will inevitably put you. And it's seen more as a thought experiment, but I do think you only get to say phrases like this if there is a spatialization of time where the future is where people live and they can look back upon you the same way we would not only look back upon the past, but as we were just saying there, manipulate it, use it, twist it, and contort it to serve our own interests in the present. The past is just clay that is powerless before us, and we can manipulate it and tell stories and make heroes or villains out of them. And we only do that to serve our current interests, which might be very well horrifying to our ancestors who just understood time as a sequential record of true and accurate things that happened. But we live in a historical period where we don't even expect that anymore. It's just what flavor of propaganda or what severity of manipulation will we tolerate. So everyone, I would say it's cynical, but I think it's bordering on nihilistic in a sense, because we are almost post-meaning. And that would also be the end of the era where we don't even really believe in truth anymore. Like, what is absolute truth? That's for the philosophers. That's not for the average person who it's just the utility of the lie that they believe in, and using the past as paint to access the superior future, which is really what most like if I had to summarize what liberals think, I think that's the only thing liberals think. It's the perfection of tomorrow and how fast they can get there. Damned be the consequences, I'm just one other thing, sir. One example. This is going to be a silly example. I'm feeling silly. I want to see a silly thing now. There's this show some people might be familiar with called Doctor Who, and it's on the BBC, I believe. And for a while, it was run by this guy named Russell T Davies. And I think this is his quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Doctor Who got infamous because it's about a fucking alien with a magic wand that goes all throughout time, different periods, Victorian England, and really they're all European. I don't think he goes to Africa, really. It's just various points in British history. But there was always blacks there. It was multi-ethnic. You didn't really see many Asians, but they made a point of showing black people there. And he was quoted at a conference, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, by saying, they're going to go back in time, and there's going to be black people there, where there wouldn't historically be black people. But we're going to will it into existence. We're going to change history, and by changing history, it will manifest that change in the present. So that is, to me, also a spatialization of time by saying we're going to fucking lie, we're going to change the past, and then that is going to change the present. It's almost like he's using fiction as time travel, and I think he believes it. He truly believes it. Whether or not it's effective is inconsequential. It's just he believes that's necessary to access the future, reworking the past through what records we have. Sorry to cut you off there.
No. That's a really good point. Is how that perception of where do we see ourselves in time, and he writes about this. He works off of Caldenius. If we want to go to page 157 on the PDF, there's it's like a page and a half. I kind of want to read out for the audience because I think this is really important for us to consider as well. So here we go. Caldenius, 1710 to 1759, at that time completely under the influence of the idea that authenticity resides in the testimony of the eyewitness, developed the domain of objects of history in terms of the contemporary, I'm not even going to try to do that, of living generations, and hence made a distinction between future generations and ancient ones. This division did not, however, arrange itself according to the substantive or chronological givens. It no longer involves epochs. It is in fact conceived epistemologically. Author, originator, or spectator are more reliable than reporters. Verbal tradition is superior to written. Ancient history thus begins at a point where no eyewitnesses exist, and directly mediating ear witnesses can no longer be questioned. With the demise of generations, then the boundary of ancient history is displaced, and it advances at the same rate that witnesses disappear. It is no longer given a temporal order, for instance, a God-given order of all history that arranges the material of history, but instead a history of the future and a history of the past. Ancient history are determined by desires and plans, as well as the questions which arise in the present. The experiential space of contemporaries is an epistemological kernel of all histories. To this extent, the epistemology of pre-modern history was supplied by Caldenius and established in a fashion that is today still unsurpassed. At the same time, however, Caldenius is thereby rendered the harbinger of modernity. Since that time, the temporal arrangement of history depends on the position one occupies within history. Caldenius assumed that history and conceptions about it usually coincide. The exposition and evaluation of a history required, however, a methodological separation. History is one, but conceptions of it are various and many. A history as such is, in his view, conceivable without contradiction, but any account of such a conception involves a break in perspective. It quite simply is decisive whether a history is judged by an interested or an alien party, by a friend or a foe, scholar or layperson, a courtier or burgher or peasant, or finally insurrectionary or loyal subject. Caldenius deduced two things from this. First, the relativity of all intuitive judgments and of all experience. Two contradictory accounts can exist, both of which have a claim to truth, for there is reason why we see the thing in this way and no other, and this is the viewpoint of the same thing. It follows from the concept of the points of view that persons regarding one thing from different points of view must have different conceptions of the same thing. Second, Caldenius deduces from his analysis of eyewitnesses and of political and social attitudes the perspective of later investigation and representation. Certainly, through proper questioning of opposing witnesses and the preservation of evidence, one has to endeavor to recognize past history oneself. To this extent, even Caldenius renders homage to a moderately realistic epistemological ideal, but the coherence of past events is not reproducible in its entirety by any form of representation. The archetype of history is itself transformed during the creation of a narrative. And I think that this is the thing that really nails it on the head for me. This is a pretty good harbinger of our modern age, that we can have many truths at the same time. The question is how do we break and tell history as itself? And I mean, narratives, of course, for modernity is based on ideology. So we can have conflicting understandings of, say, like, I don't know, for America, like the Civil War, about slavery or states' rights or the economy or identity, or even sort of the various English ethnographics that you would see in Albion Seed. But still, the perfunctory and performative narrative and ideology which claims as Americans at the time and still is today is the ideology of, say, like anti-racism, progressive liberalism, this revolutionary human emancipation, that we're somehow fulfilling the promise of a check that is yet to be cashed, as Dr. King, I say doctor in quotation marks, had said about the American founding, about all men being created equal. Those things take a place in there. And now, history itself loses coherence because now we have to talk about narrative, and history is transformed by narrative. But I think that the key thing also to take away from this point, and I'll end my little rant here, is that we occupy different spaces, and how we perceive the self inside history will determine that person and groups of persons and political narratives and formulas for how we perceive it. And I think that that holds very true to people who claim to be on the right side of history, or even people who had started the National Review, standing athwart the cliff of history, yelling "Stop."
No, that's a very good summary, and that actually leads perfectly a masterful segue into the next part I wanted to talk about. And I had to skip ahead to page 218. He says, and what we're going to do is discuss you were talking about how important the groups are, how essential the group dynamics are to history. And he continues that here. He says, my first historical thesis is that history first appeared to be generally at the dispossession of men. That is conceived as makeable, following the emergence of history as an independent and singular key concept. The step from a plurality of specific histories to a general or singular history is a semantic indicator of a new space of experience and a new horizon of expectation. And just to sidebar to that, it's hard for us to understand how our ancestors or the ancients might have thought, but there was a plurality of histories, the history of your tribe, your community, your family history, but there wasn't this superstructure called history, this giant, information sphere that all histories inhabit, or history as such. So in a way, he's saying that the birth of this idea of history as such is an important threshold to cross into modernity. Sort of the universalism of all history, or imagining history as the intersection of all these histories, and like you were just saying, the subjective histories, but there is a way to aggregate subjective history. So that's what he's saying, or if not he's saying it, that is what people believe now, and that's a belief that no one throughout history would have ever had. He continues here, one may ask the meaning of such a semantic analysis that are presented here in such a schematic and abbreviated fashion. It may be recalled that historical events and their linguistic constitution are folded into each other. The course of historical occurrences, the way they are made possible linguistically and can then be worked over, do not coincide in a simple fashion, such that, for example, an event only enters into its own linguistic registration. Rather, a tension prevails between these two poles that undergoes continual historic change. So we're talking, we're getting so far away from, again, definite linear sequential history. This is sort of like the multitudinous aspect of historical events, which again, to apprehend that idea, you need a modern mind. I'm just going to skip back here to page 216. Let me see here. I'm looking for a name. Where the fuck is this? Okay, so it says, Freiherr von Eichendorff once said in passing, the one makes history, the other writes it down. History seems to be disposable in a dual fashion, for the agent who disposes of the history that he makes, and for the historian who disposes of it by writing it up. Viewed in this way, both seem to have an unlimited freedom of decision. The scope for the disposition of history is determined by men. Before history could be grasped as something that was disposable and constructible, the conceptual field of history itself underwent a far-reaching semantic change. And that's the change I was just describing. Our contemporary concept of history, together with its numerous zones of meaning, which in part are mutually exclusive, was first constituted towards the end of the 18th century. It is an outcome of the lengthy theoretical reflections of the Enlightenment. So that is his assessment of the beginning of modernity, roughly. He doesn't give a specific date, but he's talking about the shift of the paradigm for how we even understand time itself. What do you think about that? Does that sound accurate to you?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, how we put ourselves and also what men wish to do with history becomes the preeminent question of all historians. And then later on, I think that it segues further even more when you take a look at perspective and temporality later on in the text, where we now talk about the transition from relying on, say, histories or the relative position of witnesses and contradictions to now looking at retrospection or retrospectives through criticism of texts and critical review of already existing historiographic works, and say things like, I think that we've had too little attention paid in this area of history that former historians may have looked over because of, say, prejudices or an emphasis on, say, God or whatever. And you see that a lot towards the extension of, say, new hermeneutical ways to read scriptures, or even more so now when we take a look at like the history between say like the United States and Great Britain or any progressive bugaboo issue. To me, I think that's a really important thing to consider in all this, is that we've watched that transition move quite clearly to now we don't even consider the men themselves. We just consider, well, are they like all the others, or is this something I can actually critique with any substance?
Absolutely. And let me just build on the thread I was weaving there a second ago. It says here, it was the philosophy of historical process which first detached early modernity from its past and, with a new future, inaugurated our modernity. A consciousness of time and the future begins to develop in the shadows of absolutist politics. First in secret, later openly, sustained by an audacious combination of politics and prophecy. There enters into the philosophy of progress a typical 18th century mixture of rational prediction and salvational expectation. Progress occur, and really what he's talking about here is the idea of progress, and progress in the sense of what progressives believe, or the idea that we critique this all the time. This is a common, point of critique for people in our space. But, the idea of, and this is what the Francis Fukuyamas and the secular humanists would believe, the Steven Pinkers, that we are on just an upward trajectory and have been ever since the Enlightenment. We are progressing. It can't be, there's no such thing as a decline in their worldview. It's just progressing in a positivistic fashion towards that utopia, that future which is beckoning them and judging them, as we already addressed. Moving on here, progress occurred to the extent that the state and its prognostication was never able to satisfy soteriological demands which persisted within a state whose own existence depended upon the elimination of millenarian expectations. Progress opened up a future that transcended the hitherto predictable. Natural space and time and experience, and thence, propelled by its own dynamic, provoked new transnational long-term prognoses. So really, if people's heads are spinning there, what he's doing is mounting a critique on this idea of progress without being too explicit about it. But that, to me, is really the purpose of this entire book, which is he's not political about it, even though he does draw upon political history, but he's trying to figure out, what is this thing called modernity? How has it changed how we view and manipulate history? But then really, what is progress? Because I think you cannot separate the idea of progress from modernity, for better or worse. And there's people and traditionalists on our side who are trying to revolt against that. But in their revolt against progress, they end up having to revolt against modernity, and then they have to revolt against the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. They end up ripping out the history of Western thought up by its roots. And I don't think they really understand how deep this goes into our culture, our identity, hell, the biochemical nature of how our fucking brains work. So that's a big claim I just made, but I know I'm reading a lot of things here. I know we're not going to make this like a 3-hour episode, but I just wanted to wrap that up, that sequence of ideas, jumping ahead here to page 64. I think we need to mention this. Where the hell is it? Looking for the word acceleration somewhere on here. Anyway, I'll just read it. Acceleration, because progress and acceleration work hand in glove, especially if you've read any of the technologists, if you've read Ray Kurzweil. Not only is the future imminent, we are barreling towards it at ever increasing speeds, increasing its inevitability. It says acceleration, initially perceived in terms of an apocalyptic expectation of temporal abbreviation heralding the last judgment, transformed itself into a concept of historical hope. This subjective anticipation of a future both desired and to be quickened acquired an unexpectedly solid reality. However, through the process of technicalization and the French Revolution, Kant was Immanuel Kant, not Kantbot, was the first to foresee this modern system of historical experience when he established a temporally indeterminate but nevertheless ultimate goal for the repetition of revolutionary attempts. Population increased in ever-decreasing intervals. Technically created velocities rose exponentially. The increase of production showed similar tendencies. Likewise, scientific productivity, life expectancy was rising, and hence extending generational span. From these and many other examples that could be freely multiplied, Adams drew upon the conclusion that one could no longer teach how to behave, but at most how to react. All the teacher could hope for was to teach the mind reaction, is the specific quote he gave. And I love that end there, that everything is accelerating at such a speed, you can no longer teach anyone. You can never be grounded. You are being ripped away from history by the acceleration of this culture. And maybe we feel that right now. Maybe many of us viewing this feel that. You're grasping at history as it is receding from your view, right? And maybe we're all guilty of that to one degree or another. But that is to say that they were discussing this many, many generations ago.
Yeah, and I think that also really comes in perfectly when we take a look at the word revolution, and Koselleck spends a lot of time on that. He cites quite a few German historians and philosophers. I mean, he cites Goethe quite a bit, but he also cites Johann Justus Berthus, who was a German publisher, but he also wrote some historical works as well. I mean, and he wrote about this time frame in 1800. He said that we are in a transitional period of history, and that it will take decades, if not centuries, for us to really see what we have transitioned into. And I mean, he would die in 1816, shortly after the peace in Vienna. But I think that's sort of an important thing to consider is that our understanding of revolution kind of gets categorized into two ways, and this is something that Koselleck writes about is that we have we just create a general concept for it, but revolution either possesses this political, kind of bloody, where we're changing a revolutionary like the revolution will have a paradigm shift, or we are now having a demarcating point away from a previous existing order, or itself becomes part of technological changes, the Industrial Revolution, or now our own technological revolutions, whether it's AI or nuclear power, etc. On page 67,
I think you might have the exact same segment that
quote,
I was going to read.
Same segment. Oh, perfect. Then we're good, baby. We're set.
yeah. Because I had because you can't really discuss this book without discussing how important the very concept of revolution is to our thinking. So you can continue here if you want.
Yeah, so if one can characterize our modern history as an era of revolution, one that has not yet come to its end, a certain direct experience is embodied in this formulation. Typical of this experience is the fact that it can be subsumed under the concept of revolution, more indeed than is perhaps generally allowed. The concept revolution is itself a linguistic product of our modernity. That it is possible to distinguish political, social, technological, and industrial revolutions has been accepted since the last century. Only since the French Revolution has the term revolution of a revolution, or indeed whichever language one employs, assumed a kind of ambivalent and ubiquitous semantic potential outlined above. And now we're in this chapter, he spends the whole time talking about like from the French Revolution to our modern experience, so we can understand that we've changed so greatly since the French Revolution about what that word actually means. Whether we're no longer talking about like the revolutions of bodies, we're not talking about the natural cycle. We're talking about the change in cycles, the departure from what has been. And now, instead of using terms like insurrection or civil wars or changes in the body politics or physio-political change, now we just use the revolution as a catch-all. And in sort of the greater Western public understanding or public consciousness, we really do think about things only in the sense of revolution.
Yeah, it's the only thing that matters.
Absolutely.
Which is wild to think of. Revolution is something we roll our eyes at in a sense now. There's many leftists and communists that still embrace the early 20th century revolutionary iconography, but it's very kitschy. You get the sense that they like it because it's fashionable. But a revolution is something that Pepsi does as well. Apple releasing a new product is revolutionary. It's something that we expect from fucking video game consoles. The next GTA 6 is going to be revolutionary. It's become commoditized. It's become just an expectation, something to represent energy and rebirth and revitalization, which isn't what revolution is, but that's just what it means now. And it's become so immersed in our culture that it lacks any, I would argue it lacks any sort of political power. I think that anyone, and this is what we're talking about before, about the end of an era, what could signal that, I think is the death of this idea of revolution. It's something people still agitate for, but are they agitating for it because they feel that that's something they're supposed to do, or that's the language people understand so you can take notice, right? But so if you're not speaking in revolutionary terms, people don't listen, but it has no revolutionary character. It's just pop culture. It's just fashion. It's just like a trend. So yeah, and I think so any social change from here on out wouldn't necessarily be revolutionary or have a revolutionary character. Just to return to what we were talking about before, about what the end of an era or the end of a paradigm shift, what that would look like. It's hard to wrap your head around because it would be abandoning things that are very important to us now to history. But I think you can look around and people kind of sense that something's changing. People feel that they're in a pivot point in history, I think, at least in the West over here. But anyway, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is what he really hammers home. He's just like, prior to, say, the Glorious Revolution in England, or even the French Revolution, like those two things really do change the mental model for both Anglo as well as continental historical understanding for the word revolution, and this changes now because we're not looking at things circular or cyclical. We're instead looking at them as a transitory thing. And also the fact that we no longer use older phrases to talk about civil war or internal conflict or even the old Dutch concept of the right to resistance. We don't use Vijong, we don't use civil war as much, or Burgerkrieg for, like peasant revolts or internal fights between city-states. We don't really do that. And instead, we just call these things revolutions or upheavals. Only recently are we using insurrection in America for J6 because there's a law for the Insurrection Act and things to put down an insurrection. But even then, that is very archaic language to the average Westerner and especially to the average American. They don't really understand what that means. And clearly, as we talk about the J6 stuff or even the responses to it or even conservatives doing the har, what if the sides were reversed type deal, that all that does is make the word more impotent. And it empowers the violence that comes from these people that do believe they're engaging in some kind of revolutionary rebellion. And two, with that being said, that also comes with this optimism. The left are optimists in the sense that they believe that the revolution will win. The revolution is probably going to be televised if there ever will be one, or hell, it's been televised. Because even in American conservative circles, you have the very famous People's Pottage that was written after FDR got into office. The revolution was making the claim to conservatives and the old right of the early 20th century that, like, listen, the revolution came and went in the night of the Great Depression. As he opens up his essay, which is still worth reading, even if you disagree with his conclusions or your views on FDR. It really does illustrate the changing of our words and our understanding. Like, there are great changes, and we have now transitioned into something else. And that is something that's really important for our own conceptualization of history. Because if we don't, to borrow what you were talking about earlier, Dimes, with acceleration, on page 73 of the PDF, he writes, the experience of acceleration also cannot be overlooked. Behind Robespierre's vow to his fellow citizens to accelerate the French Revolution in order that freedom might be gained quickly, it is possible to detect an unconscious secularization of eschatological expectation. From Leconte to Luther to Bengel, a temporal abbreviation was to be taken as a sign of the approaching destruction of historical time in general. But since the onset of such acceleration, the tempo of historical time has constantly been changing, and today, thanks to the population explosion, development of technological powers, and the consequent frequent changes of regime, acceleration belongs to everyday experience. The uniform and natural horizon of history has since been left far behind. The accelerative experience drew forth new perspectives imbued with the concept of revolution. And I think this is a really important point to kind of hit at here, because even sort of talking about, like, your prediction, like the watering down or the withering away of ideology, everyone is a revolutionary in their mindset. For better or for worse, because we all look at what we're doing as an abbreviation from the natural order of things, or even the status quo ante of what had came beforehand politically. Also with technology and the rest, like the fact that questions on immigration, right? Like, assimilation is largely a myth, but it was a lot easier to maybe assimilate someone or force them to act like a wasp if you had no way to really contact home very often. And instead, if you were to get in an Uber, you're going to either listen to an Indian or Pakistani man be on the phone on WhatsApp with his family back home all hours of the day, even if they're not talking or saying anything, they're just on the fucking phone, or listening to a podcast in their own language or whatever. Like, clearly, there's no way for you to ever, get with the times or to get with the place that you moved into, because you have the technological means to never become deracinated and to become white, or, have a white shift experience. And the same thing with our understanding of history too. Like, things change so fast that our reliance on older orders or traditions becomes really questionable, because it's like, well, there is no technological equivalent to what we're doing with now. That's a claim I've heard quite a few people make. But then for me as a Christian, at least, I can read stuff out of the Philokalia or Sayings of the Desert Fathers and read scripture and be like, oh, well, there's a lot here that clearly I can relate to, or that has obvious allegory or still fits under these categorizations of the divinely inspired word of God. Like, I'm not really too worried about that. And it just depends on, again, how we view ourselves inside of history. And that's why I think when we look at this book, like the emphasis on anthropology, the evolution of how we perceive history from this demarcated linear thing with a not so distant, but we never know when it's going to come kind of end time in the West, to now, well, that end can be immanentized at any point in time, but also we never know when it's going to come, because our ability to look at history has been broken down into all these like niche general concepts that we can just categorize things into. Like, oh, we're talking about like the history of technology. We're talking about the history of the internet. We're talking about the history of memes. We're talking about the history of XYZ. And we never allow ourselves to maybe take a step back as an outside observer and analyze maybe how this stuff all plays a role. Ironically, the thing that we do that all the time with on Twitter is like the domino meme that people like to post. I had one that went viral a while back where it was like, Zoe Quinn blows 5 guys, and then the top domino is like ICE has the funding of a military budget of like 23 countries combined. Like, it's dumb, but like you could argue that if you want. There's a K line there to pull Minsky out. But again, like, that's the sort of acceleration and revolutionary viewpoint that even people on the right or the online right or the far right or whatever you want to call it, they also inhabit this worldview, because it is just so ingrained in the Western public consciousness.
Yeah, and you made a point there about, and I don't want to be misconstrued that, I don't think any of us can really escape the framework of acceleration. There are accelerationists right now. There's an ism for acceleration, but those people, to me, to give them some credit, seem to recognize what we recognize and have decided to be on the side of accelerationism. In a sense, that's Nick Land as well, saying we must run towards an inevitability because why not? Let us embrace that undeniable aspect of ourselves. And just to build into a slightly different direction, I wanted to mention this, and this is a good tee up for that. I'm looking at Zed Des here. He has a comment. I missed the beginning of the stream. Was the motivation for this related to the recent knowledge that Black Africans don't think in terms of the future if it hasn't been experienced? It's a good question. I can relate this, and this is important to understand this book. As I said, I believe the book takes a Western-centric view of this because I don't think most regions in the world would share this understanding of time. I think in East Asia they probably do now, but I'm thinking specifically of Africa. I'm thinking of maybe a lot of the indigenous South Americans, for example. There's this really great book that I haven't finished yet, but I'm mostly through, called The Master and His Emissary. And let me just pull that up right here. Okay. We're going to talk about this on Blood Satellite as well, but it's very, very long. It's around 800 pages, and there's a lot there. We could have probably even covered it on this show, if I'm being honest. But it's subtitled "The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World." So I'm just going to briefly glance at this as much as I can to serve the larger point. The whole book is about the left brain and the right brain, those two hemispheres. A lot of people understand that the left brain is for certain types of thinking and the right brain is for another type of thinking. And language is more closely associated with one side, and different K lines. We talked about Marvin Minsky there. Prue brought that up just a second ago. But certain memories live on one side of the brain. And the idea was that what you might call the European way of looking at things, or even more vaguely, the Western way of looking at things, owes a debt to which hemisphere of the brain we utilize more than the other, and that separates us from much of the rest of the world. Okay, so what does that mean? One side of the brain, and I'm giving the loosest explanation of what the book gets into, and it's very, very interesting. There's a lot of examples, a lot of information in there. But one side of the brain is for assessing the immediate world, and it takes a much wider scope of information in, and it tries to process that, but it doesn't have much to do with the longevity. Whereas the other side of your brain is for conceptual frameworks. It's for systems thinking. That's where ideology lives. So your immediate brain might be for pattern recognition. You recognize patterns very easily. But then the other side of the brain is for making sense of that patterns and comparing, contrasting it against what we know. And so the argument in the book is the Western mind tilts more towards that systems thinking, right? And that has to do with time. That's to do with longevity. That's to do with long-term thinking in either direction, in past or future. So the argument could be made, and we're not going to get into Julian Jaynes here because we've gotten into that in previous episodes, but the idea is that if you have more of a mind for permanence, you won't live in the immediate world. So it allows you to predict the future. It allows you to assess the past. However, you can become imprisoned there. You can refuse to take in new information. You cannot update your conceptual models, and that can hurt your long-term survival as well. So, and this is the argument that McLuhan was making even when he was saying we are now entering the global village. A lot of people thought that just meant globalism. It didn't mean globalism. It meant that we're entering into almost like a third world way of thinking, a more savage way of thinking, where everything's more lateral, more immersive. It's less isolationist because a lot of people will decry atomization and individuality as the dark side of liberalism, but that actually is one of the features. Whereas, the idea of what you might say the longhouse, or, you're lost in this massive community. So that's where you get the idea that everything, perhaps the Western mind is being forced to tilt to that hemisphere of the brain, taking in more information, living less in its conceptual frameworks, and rethinking how we assess time. So that's what McLuhan was saying. We're entering the global village against our will, and we are psychologically and ideologically ill-equipped to do that because it's totally, anathema to our way of thinking. Sorry, I got off into the weeds there.
Well,
a little
I think
bit.
that's very accurate. I mean, especially when you conceptualize your understanding of history. I mean, he wrote about this a lot when McLuhan writes about Orientalization, like Western man, because now we are entering our mediums and our essence and our exposure to the outside world has fundamentally transformed Western culture. And so this shift has now changed us away from linear, rational, and individualistic modes of understanding about ourselves. And now we have to sort of look towards a more auditory, tactile, and we're now introspective, and we're also far more tribal. And we see this online, like our tribalism, all these little gangs of group chats that'll do drive-bys of shit flinging and flame warring and rage baiting and trolling people, because violence is a quest for identity, but we can't really go out and beat the shit out of each other anymore. And we don't do duels. We're not doing drive-bys. We're doing the white man's drive-by of trying to dox and ratio people on twitter.com, which is really sad. But again, it's sort of this weird specialization, and also a weird kind of, speciation of what came before us. And now with these new technologies, our understanding of time changes, because now we're looking at them in a way that are, where we have these Oriental characteristics. McLuhan would call them like mystical, tribal, non-literate, and we're playing off synthesasia, and we're appreciating things that we wouldn't always call Western. And instead, we're putting this, we can't really universalize things, and instead the Oriental field of experience is now fundamentally changing Western man. And there's a very reactionary reading to McLuhan, and I think you can borrow this into Koselleck's understanding of how we conceptualize history and time. Western man has the ability to understand a far-off future, or to even think about the generations that will come long after him. And a lot of high church, traditions of Christianity, Anglicanism, Lutheranism, Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy have specific things in mind, thinking that far ahead. There are old versions of the Anglican Common Book of Prayer that have the calculation for Western Eastern out to the year 8000. We can think that far ahead. You cannot have a concept of history when you don't think about the future, and you're only in the present or something that doesn't really exist. That's why I find that everyone kind of pouncing on that Africa time video is so fundamentally important, because it's like, this is what will happen to you if we continue to import these people here, but also allow people who have no understanding or concept of history to begin with, because there is no such thing as the future and there's no such thing to plan for, let alone a past. Now that too will be part of the medium of your phone, of AI and technology and the rest, that are now going to become day-to-day part and parcel parts of Western existence, unless we radically depart from that and we change back to our visual, linear, rational thinking. But even then, McLuhan was terrified towards the end of his life that it was too far gone.
Yeah, and that's an interesting, is just getting back to the original question, which is, why can't Africans understand this? Because if you were to offload the responsibility of the future onto AI, because that's what some of these people hope for, some mechanical guru or some hyper intelligent genie that can just own the future to deliver.
I have
the
no
future.
brain and I must rock.
Yeah, well, basically, like, the future is something you are directly responsible for. You cannot remove yourself from the manifestation of history, just like you cannot remove your interpretation from the existence of human history. Like, you are participating in the future. You are an embodiment of the past. You have agency within this energy flux right now, and we're always trying to like segment ourselves away from that and remove ourselves from it, or seeking to find some mechanical option to, can we get to the truth of history? Well, maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it. You're trying to find a universal accuracy in the history of the world, in a universal history, and that's not what it's fucking for. Similarly, like, the future isn't a god that you're servicing. You're not trying to appeal to the god of the future, which is also manifested in you. In fact, by the way, I don't know if we brought this up before. That's what the Collinses believe. You know those two?
Yeah.
Those two fun people, America's favorite couple. Their religion, they've said this before. They wrote a blog about it, which we reviewed on Real Secret Coffee Hours, my paywall show. Their religion is their future selves, like their future perfected transhumanist selves that they believe are beckoning them future. So they must do everything in their power to serve their future gods, which are the Collinses. And if you've seen them, that's fucking horrifying. Just imagine that, but also fucking a Borg version of those two. Anyway, I'm just getting mean now. I'm getting a bit nasty. We're at an hour and a half. This is the nasty hour. But yeah, like, this isn't all just us inventing things. There's people who believe this shit right now, and there's more of them than you would like to believe. Look, dimes, coins going up. Thank you, requited.
We need dimes, coin.
Mindzer says, what % of people would you guys estimate are at the I have no brain and I must grok point in the AI revolution? What do you think?
That's a good question. And also to relate it to the text we're covering, I think that's in the chapter or mutation of historical experience. You have this thing about asymmetric counter concepts, and this is where it's like Helene versus barbarian, or Christian versus heathen, or even today some of that still exists online with Christian versus pagan. But you're asking yourself the question about, like, well, am I a shape rotator, or am I just like a man with no internal monologue, right? Like, we come up with these counter conceptual understandings of ourselves versus the other. And for history, that becomes a way in which you can also apply time, and also later on apply an ideology to manipulate space in order for you to have control over things. I think it's become a very clear, clearly I don't know the population number or how not, but here's my spicy take, since we're an hour and a half in. So hello to the strange, weird Fed boys that are listening this far in. I hope you've enjoyed the book so far. But, like, I think that the number will surprise you, and all that it's going to do is just more or less confirm a lot of what Lothrop Stoddard was writing 100 years ago. And that, you see the grok stuff, you see people getting accused of being Indian on Twitter and the rest of that. I think that the number I don't know if we'll ever know the full number, but really what you're watching is for lack of a better politically correct term, you're just watching the rising tide of color just for internet usage. And I think that number will surprise all of us, but also because as we continue to connect most of the developing world to the internet, like, our counter conceptual format will have to deal with, well, can you think for yourself and actually do research and read books and talk about them in the way that we are? Or are you going to outsource things to AI models like Grok, for example, getting a lot of its data readings and recordings from fucking Reddit of all places? So not only are we being orientalized as Westerners with these mediums of technology, but we're also Westernizing or Occidentalizing these strange developing nations on how to scam, get money, and to generate things. And we already saw that was sort of like the India engagement baiting for Twitter bucks, right? Like, even Carl Benjamin of all people covered that too not too long ago. And I think that we won't know the exact number, but I think that it's very clear for us to say that our ability to look at ourselves in a point of history is that we are now in this strange conceptual format where we're not isolated. Like, our understanding of the world can't just be some transitional route of a family of history or family of people that now we're all these different tribes or whatever. Like, now it's like, well, no, these things are very clearly different. They think differently than we do. They don't even conceptualize the future or even think about it in the same way that you and I do, and somehow we're supposed to coexist. And that's a very dangerous thing politically, especially when the only way we talk about politics and history in the 21st century is in revolution.
Yeah, and that was a great point, a great series of points. And just to address that question myself, I wonder how much of it is related to IQ, because I've seen some people of middling IQ and maybe even some of high IQ that are enthusiastic about AI, just like the dumbest fucking asshole that you could ever meet. You see what I'm saying? So it's how much of it's correlated to AI and how much of it's correlated to, and this might sound even worse, lack of a soul, or something else, because there's many different measures for someone's mental capacity. There's IQ, then there's G, which is general intelligence. Then there's, other ways to measure, I guess, mental illness and defects. But like, there's something to the shape rotator problem. Like, is shape the ability to picture a shape in your mind and rotate it around? Is how correlated is that to AI, to IQ? Versus, or there's people who have high IQs that can't do that. There's people with high IQs and who can solve problems, think fast. Maybe they're even highly competent at math, but they lack that ability to think abstractly in any other sense. Or maybe they fall for the breakfast question. So there's something else going on there. So to me, AI is revealing that, sordid dimension, like what actually separates us from the people, IQ aside, the ability to think abstractly, or as I was saying before, certain biochemical left brain versus right things, how much of how you think, regardless of your intelligence, is more on the side of just taking in immediate information and parsing through it and finding patterns, which is a skill in itself, but you don't have access to higher level conceptual frameworks. So as intelligent as you might be, you still can't think, you wouldn't even know how to begin thinking 50 years in the future. That is barred off to you. And you don't feel unhappy about that. You don't feel any which way about that. But for people who can do that, you're forced to see these people as a liability in the realm of politics, in the realm of planning for the future, as intelligent, as skilled as they might be. So what's the percentage of the population? I mean, short answer is I don't know, but I think we're only beginning to start counting these people, because these people don't even know that they're deficient in some ways. It doesn't mean they're evil. It doesn't mean they're ticking time bombs in any other way. But you're going to start to notice that these people just can't think in the same way you can. And I think that manifests most immediately in the realm of politics. Like they really can't, you can't have a conversation with them about the future, because the future doesn't really exist to them. They're in a savage mindset. They don't understand higher order ideas at all. And many foreigners are like this as well. Like we'll just get racist about it if we want to. I find that with Europeans, specifically white men, we adhere to things like duty. There's these old tests that, would you behave in such a fashion if no one was watching you? If you're in the middle of the woods, would you, and you're alone for 100 miles in every direction, would you still adhere to your values? Or, as you see in China and the Middle East, do you only behave in this way when you think people are watching you? And if you're convinced no one's watching you, or you're convinced you can get away with something, do you do it? Now, for a European man, they wouldn't do that because there's a principle to it. I'm not going to do this thing because I don't believe in it. It's not even because I think God is watching me. There's something deeper than that. That is not accepted in the rest of the world. The entire rest of the world is run on cons and scams and fucking treachery for everything. Every transaction. Look at what driving is like in India. You want to see? You want to see hell? I can show you hell. Look at fucking Egypt from 200 feet in the air. That's fucking hell. I know that I've seen some people talk about that recently, but you can't even understand that these people can't even, they don't believe in truth, or they don't believe that there's such a thing as like a higher order way of living. So anyway, I got off in the weeds on that one as well, but this ties into everything we're talking about. Like, can you imagine the future? Can you imagine anything? Can you contextualize? Can you spatialize anything? And most people can't. And as we talk about the end of an era, the end of an epoch, a paradigm shift, I think the casualties of that are going to be the people, not even necessarily low IQ, but the people who can't even think abstractly and don't know when they're falling into the orbit of a nefarious actor, neurobiological warfare. I mean, that's a whole other thing we can get into, but I need to look at the chat to see if I'm doing a good job. What do you say? What do you say? Oh, we have an Indian flag here. Good. Thanks. This is good. This is a good thing.
I think one of the things too to look at towards the end of the book, I've got a hard cap for the next 30 minutes here, but he writes, if anyone had said before 1780 that he studied history, he would have once been asked by his interlocutor, which history? History of what? Imperial history, or the history of a theological doctrine, or perhaps the history of France? As said earlier, history could only be conceived together with an associated subject that underwent change or upon which change occurred. This new expression, history in general, was thus initially suspected as being modish, and the degree to which it was considered dubious is illustrated by the fact that Lessig, in his historico-philosophical outline of the education of the human species, avoided the expression in his history, to say nothing of the use of the term history in general without an article. The surprise is that the new concept, soon a slogan, could give rise to, were illuminated by a scene at the court in Berlin. Beister once replied thus to Frederick the Great's inquiring after what he was doing. He occupied himself famously with history. The king stopped short and asked whether that meant the same as history, because Beister supposed the king was unfamiliar with the expression, the history. Of course, Frederick knew the word history, but not the new concept. History is a collective singular without reference to an associated subject, or alternatively, object determined by narration. And again, we have semantic changes now for our perception of history. Because now we say, oh, I have a history degree. Well, what did you major in? What did you specialize in? Da-da-da-da-da. Like, and people say, oh, just history. Like, what? This is a very unfathomable thing. Even for me, it's like, well, you can't just say, oh, I study history. Like, well, there's like historiography. There's all the things that maybe that's just my Western European brain saying, like, so what did you specify in? Because you can have people interview all the time saying like, well, we're going to talk about, I don't know, Joseph Stalin. And it's just like, well, I have a history degree. Well, like, so did you study like the Soviet Union? Did you study like the Stalin's administration?
No, I did the greatest hits. I did, the broad strokes.
Yeah, just the broad strokes, just like vibes. There's a semantic shift in term to use for the.
I love this comment here by Sean Weiland. He says, history is a set of lies agreed upon, quote, by Napoleon, supposedly. It's the supposedly that I love. That's kind of the point. Like, maybe
allegedly.
He said it. Maybe he fucking didn't say it. Does it matter? He said it now, right? We had someone here saying my brain was mush. Rude. I know we got to get going soon, unfortunately. I think we pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover. Is there anything else that you think we missed in this book?
I mean, there's plenty of things in which we can. We didn't cover the whole thing, nor should we. Or we're trying to cover as much as possible. But I think that, of course, if you want to read this, I can post the link to the wonderful book that you can read for free if you so wish. The last thing that I kind of wanted to sort of talk about, and we can sort of maybe conclude on this point, is talking about the just history as maybe in terms of anthropology, because our historical experiences are always going to be changing based on how we understand the world. In categorizing various groups and peoples and things such as that, because he argues, at least towards the end of the book in the third section, that when we look at, say, people who've written about history before, like D'Alembert and Diderot constructed a whole of history according to the spectrum of their imminent temporal rhythms. They looked for the unique conditions of historical phenomenon in particular.
So what page is this?
This is page 261. But they looked for, I'm just going to keep reading it. They looked for the unique conditions of historical phenomenon, in particular of the sciences and possible intellectual constructions. Men who were ahead of their times were emphasized so that they were subsequent fulfillment of their designs could be registered. The posterity of yet as unenlightened masses became a subject for their own education. The project of the encyclopedia became conceived in the consciousness of a unique historical situation. The two men saw themselves as pressed for time. Preparation of all technical potentialities and all knowledge had to be made in time for future action, even in the event of catastrophe. In this way, history constituted itself according to an imminent, anthropologically based criteria of the before and after. The criteria that were for the past no longer susceptible to change. This historical reflection also evoked a too early or a too late in means of influencing the future through accelerated enlightenment. The encyclopedists operated this with a highly sensitized historical consciousness, which developed for the moment of time, duration, and time period a common frame, the frame of progress, according to which the whole of history could be interpreted universally. This, I think, this is building off of the expansion of one's own internal time based upon where they're in, whether it's the opening of the globe with the discovery of the Americas, or that we are now sort of changing our understanding of our relationship to God as we continue to explore. Francis Bacon had said that, God for mankind, not only because of aid and benevolence, but also through a state of comparison of how we look at ourselves in comparison to something greater. And this period that he spends so much time looking at, this transitionary period from the Renaissance and the French Revolution, we're now entering sort of this new time frame, and we have to understand that what comes now with our in our modern man and the 20th century man, and even ourselves in the 21st, we have an epochal consciousness that becomes prevalent in the late 18th century. But now our temporal determinants means that we experience the future based on our own experience of time. And because for us, time is constantly accelerating, our ability to predict, to perceive the future, or the otherness of what might come in the future changes, because the future can be tomorrow. Something new can be radically deployed, a new algorithm, a new change to artificial intelligence, or how things get nudged our way, or something else mimetically, to relate to our other book, can spread like wildfire. And we can lead ourselves into one period of how we looked at things versus the other. Like, I mean, you can look at older forms of the online right as a really good example of this. Like, could you imagine even 10 years ago that we're all laughing about this guy coming down the escalator in New York, that now we're talking about, remigration, or everything in Britain has gone the way that it has, or, that we're dealing with like an exponential explosion of transgender cases that are now so socially and politically schizophrenic that ideology becomes a real question for them, because they just seem to be terminally online, and then they, kill a bunch of Catholic kids, which somehow automatically means that it's about some other group of people. But all these things about this book, we're now we have this temporal uncertainty because we can experience the future instantly. And we have to look at history through an anthropological lens, because if we don't, and we don't look at these things in terms of concepts or how we frame or categorize concepts, we lose our ability to understand history better. And I think this book is really good for anyone to read when we talk about history or try to say the history of something, in part because our experiences of time are so radically different that we have to look backwards to see not only how our ancestors perceived time, but also because there were changes, like we talked about in spinal catastrophism, like the people who experienced railway spine, right? Like, we've never gone so fast before, this form of acceleration, a very physical one. Now we get to experience that psychologically. Like, I make the joke all the time. 2017 is almost 10 years ago. And that's when you could see Anita Sarkeesian call Carl Benjamin a garbage human being at VidCon. For a lot of people, they find that to be this funny moment of online Gamergate politics. But you say that
was our raising the flag at Iwo Jima.
But like, exactly, right? That was 1,000 years ago. And again, to sort of maybe predicate this in Christian terms, you also look in the Psalter, 1,000 years, O Lord, as is a watch in the, as is yesterday, as a watch in the night, and I think that's sort of something to sort of consider, that our understanding of time or our perception of it, of course, relates differently to the divine. But even now, a watch in the night is something that we don't do, but we kind of stay up, or we kind of keep watch of things. And in doing so, we have temporalized and contemporalized all things in the little boxes for little eras. We're on an arc. We're on an era. I want the lore of something. And so we lose historical truth for the sake of semantic or conceptual truth that feels good to us, because we're still in an ideological age. Whether we emerge out of that in this new epoch remains to be seen. But I think that this is why I find this book so important. Because if we don't talk about the concepts of enlightenment or science or sociology, we can easily get bogged down in the weeds of ideologically charged terms, and instead not looking at the words or the concepts and the worldviews that the people who wrote those histories back then had. Which is why I thought it was so funny to reference Stoddard again when Tucker had Oren on. He was just like, they wrote in such a different way than we did. Just read a Stoddard book and you'd see what I mean.
Slip that one right in.
Sure did.
If I could just add on that, then and we can get going. We're talking about the temporalization of history. I'm on page 263. It says, history was temporalized in the sense that thanks to the passing of time, it altered according to the given present, and with growing distance, the nature of the past also altered. Stated more exactly, history stood revealed in its current truth. New Zeitz, I assume that means new time, lent the whole of a past a world historical quality. With this, the novelty of a history in emergence reflected as new assumed a progressively growing claim to the whole of history. It became regarded as self-evident that history as world history had to be continually rewritten. Quote, that world history has to be rewritten from time to time is no longer doubted by anyone these days, as Goethe soon afterwards summed up this change in viewpoint. I think that's probably a good enough place to cap that idea as any. And I love the as we're going back in time and quoting these figures, there was an assessment back then that this was happening, and we just inhabit it right now, just like a fish not knowing that it's underwater. There was a time as this was itself a transition that people were noticing. I think there's some comments earlier in the chat about how, you know, the minds of young people have been warped by AI. You know, they don't even know how to ask certain questions anymore. Or the idea is like how, and we talked about this even recently on an episode about frictionless markets. Like, how much are you surrendering your agency to AI, in the sense that you're no longer asking questions, you're expecting answers before you even ask them. So you've lost control of the problem arrow solution chain. You no longer present a question, you're expecting the answer to just be predicted algorithmically and deposited to you. And I think if you do that, elements of your brain start to die, and huge sections of your soul start to die as well. And I don't think that's inevitable. I don't think, you know, I don't accept that that's the acceleration that we need. Because I you know, if you...
It really does depend, I think, on if it sells, or if they see it, like if there's a tangible productivity benefit. Like, I know Microsoft's like Copilot, they've noticed that they kind of started pulling it back in their own headquarters. So they're like, oh, this is making our workers less productive. But I saw an advertisement today. I don't watch a lot of television. I only watch television with my fiance. This is the only reason why I saw this advertisement.
She's got you watching the Netflix dating shows, doesn't she?
No, I'm watching like old cooking shows from like 30 years ago. But I mean, which is fine. I like to cook. But there was an advertisement that popped up. I think it's for a new Samsung phone, and it was talking about like its AI capabilities. And it's like, if there's something in your phone, shouldn't your phone be the first to answer before you? And it has like someone asking like, hey, what's the address we're going to? And then the phone pulls up the address, and then you just click on it, and then it sends it as a text. And I thought, well, that's, you know, I mean, like, again, that expectation of an answer before, you know, asking a question or anything like that, like the chain of custody for an idea or an answer or a fact is lost in that way. And for a lot of people, I don't expect them to have that kind of chain of custody. Like, I really only expect a certain kind of person, and you can say that that's bigoted or whatever, but like, I think that our the IQs or just like the historical record of like great civilizations or peoples kind of give me a good indication structurally speaking, like, okay, well maybe you can build something, but like really it's been limited to like a certain geographic area. And it's not this like determinism of like guns, germs, and steel. It's not just that, and it's not that book at all, really. That book's got a lot of problems. But I mean, it really does boil down to like our temporalization and our ability to understand speed is really radical. And this is why I think it's so funny that we've swung now to a German writer after we've covered so many French writers and concepts. But I can't help but go back to Paul Virilio and him studying dramology, the study of speed, the study of acceleration, the study of accidents. Because with every new invention, we inadvertently create or invent the accident, even if that accident hasn't happened yet. We invent the first train, we've invented the first train derailment, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that there will be a great historical accident as we have this new epoch or this new understanding of temporalization. And only time will tell what will come next from that. But I really do think that we've invented this great history accident wherein, however we perceive history and the rest will inevitably create an accident where we lose track or even our own ability to understand history, period, in any shape or form, because history is ever present. Like the real black pill nightmare scenario I think of is that due to a combination of AI, immigration, demographics, and market forces, that we will all be on Africa time. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, and that's the immediate oncoming socio-political reality that I'm terrified of. There's the lurid fantasies that spring to mind, similar to Camp of the Saints, right? But then even worse for me is the what do you call Orientalization, or some might say negrification of our minds, and that that can come by way of technology. That doesn't come by way of listening to more hip hop or shaking your ass in a different sort of way. That's not great. But then there's this other thing, and again, this is what McLuhan was talking about. How you're becoming sort of third worldized in your thinking, and that's happening in many different ways. We won't need to get into that right now, but sorry, we have one nice comment here. Wanted to highlight this. I hope for more of these convos between the two of you, a real treasure that I look forward to and am grateful for. Cheers from Quebec. Wow, I got a Quebec friend. What do you think about that?
That's a nice. That's nice. I have one super chat over here from Mr. Wingman, who sends a very generous $10. He says, "Sup?" I says, "I'm still wanting that cultural and spiritual review of that K-pop Demon Hunters thing on Netflix. I don't know if that's going to happen, good sir, but maybe. I doubt it. We'll see." That's all I'm going to say. But thank you for the generous $10.
What are the odds that K-pop Demon Hunters is good, though?
I saw the only reason why I saw this blow up is because someone was talking about using like postmodern hermeneutics on media criticism. They're like, leftists do it all the time, but when rightists do it, they get all upset. Because I think some YouTuber had made a review saying like Netflix just accidentally made a Christian film. And I was like, I have not watched the show. I have not watched this review. I don't step foot in a lot of media review criticism discourse because like my frame of reference for TV and movies is like 10 to 20 years old. Like when I watch television with my girlfriend and my fiance now, but like I introduced her to like Hannibal, like the 3 seasons that were on there. That show's like 10 years old, if not more. She's like, wow, it's really good TV, and I'm like, cool. I hope that you like all the other TV shows from like 2014 and prior, because that's all my frame of reference has. I don't have a television in my apartment, and I'm dreading the day when that changes.
So she likes Hannibal. Does she like the earlier seasons where it's a real show, or the later seasons where it's like an existentialist, gay murder romance?
Well, I don't think we got to the 3rd season yet. So the first 2 are really good, and then the 3rd is like, well, we're going to adapt Red Dragon, and then it turns really fucking gay.
It's like, I wish I could quit you in every scene that they're in. Like that, it's just they become different characters. It's such an odd show. But yeah, that's how you know you're going to get married. You're going to be a married man. You're going to be a wife guy. You just watch the same old shit again and again and again.
I told my group chat one time after the engagement happened. I said, if I turn into one of those annoying wife guys on Twitter, you have permission to find me and kill me.
It's easy not to become a wife guy too. Just don't like when you put your wife in your bio, like a freak, like a sicko. I don't want anyone knowing about my wife. I want them to know about my failures. I want them to know.
I just got a message from our mutual friend Capitalissimo. He's like, I'll watch K-pop Demon Hunters with you if you want to actually do a review. Well, if my gaming buddy says yes to that, then I guess that guy's gonna get his fucking wish. So I hope you're happy. Live on air, you got an answer to that question. But I don't know what we're gonna cover next. Actually, I think I have an idea of what we might cover next. But
there's a couple of options. There's one.
We have some silly books and we have some serious ones.
I think what we're gonna do, I think this makes the most sense, is we're gonna do a special crossover episode between Blood Satellite and Do You Even Read, which means that you and me and Juice are just gonna do a stream, but we are going to cover Lauren Southern's book, her autobiography. It's going to be a very special bitch watch. But we will not sully the good name of Do You Even Read with that, because it's going to get messy. It's going to get nasty in that one.
Outside of that, there's a book I really do want us to cover, and it is on media from Lumen. And it is, if I recall correctly, it's Nicholas Luhmann, and it's called The Reality of Mass Media, Cultural Memory in the Present. And I was told by a mutual friend of ours to go read it. It came out in 2000, so this is a more recent book, but it's only 160 pages. I feel like this would be a good quick one episode. Luhmann's also responsible for systems theory and social systems theory, but I think that a media book, especially one that's like from 2000, would be really good to cover.
I like that.
So we have Bitch Watch and we've got media. So you've got your theory and your pop culture, pop politics book. Although I have to laugh because I told Dimes when I looked up the book, because I didn't know if it was available yet. Apparently it just came out in July. When I look up her book, This Is Not Real Life by Lauren Southern, the sponsored advertisement right under all the book details is Memoirs of a Slave. And it looks like some kind of literature, if you know what I'm saying. So,
if you could read between the lines of that dog whistle,
yeah, it's a real page flicker, if you know what I'm saying. So, we have a lot of fun stuff coming up, guys.
Let me just say, the one book I really want to get to, and it's going to be too large to get to for the next episode, I think, and we owe ourselves a fun one. It's this book. I've had on the list for quite some time. It's called The Transformation of the World, A Global History of the 19th Century. And I think covering this book
would be fun.
After we just covered the book we were presently talking about, I think that would be perfect. It's by Jürgen Osterhammel. It's a panoramic global history of the 19th century. I know a lot of people I deeply respect have covered this. You can make 5 episodes on this, but I think we could find a conceptual through line through this thing and make it really work without overwhelming people. But I've had that on the list for so long. But we might need to do a silly one. We might need to take a detour down Fun Avenue.
I like this one comment from Capitalissimo. He says, "Bean blocking in the literature section."
Okay, let me see. Can we put that up? Do I have that here? Oh, yeah. Bean blocking in the literature section. See, if you stick with this stream, it's a real treat right at the end. For the real day ones who know that the last half hour is fucking...
It's always a good time.
It's dogs out, hogs out. Oh, so Sean Weiland just ordered it. What did he order, Sean? We've been talking about a lot of shit. Oh, sorry. Wingman 4, thanks for the review in advance. The song where the demons are seducing soul splice with the Dies Irae has made into my workout playlist.
Oh boy. Well, thank you again, Wingman. I appreciate the extra $10 there. So I will definitely have to go. Capitalissimo and I are going to go watch it, review it. So there you go.
Look at Sean Weiland just posted an emoji. You can't see it here, but I assume
it's just
beans. It's just beans.
Beans.
You mean a nasty boy, Sean. It's too late. It's too late for you.
The 19th century history one.
By the way, I think I made a grievous error for those who know, on our last gaming stream. Were we playing the game with Sean Weiland, or was it someone else?
No, that was Sean Schaefer, who's a friend of Oswald Art, who makes some artwork for myself, Geo, and the Tukey's Mag boys.
Okay, so for those who are tuning in, we were playing Helldivers, having a rip-roaring good time. I was operating under the assumption it was Sean Weiland we were playing with. So I said a series
I think he bought the game.
I said many incoherent things, assuming it was a different guy. So if people are wondering what the fuck I was on, that's it.
It's okay. I for like the longest time. So there's a guy on my YouTube chat who goes by Vulpes Persona, and I always assumed for the longest time that was my Twitter mutual, who is this Flemish gentleman who also goes by Vulpes Persona on Twitter. And so when this guy for like the last 2 years is like, oh, I saw you at the conference, and I would DM my Twitter friend, I'm like, I don't remember meeting this Flemish Dutch guy from, I would have recognized the accent because I've had you on the show before. And I'm just like, and then he finally set the record straight with me over this last OGC conference. He's like,
how the fuck are there two Vulpes Personas? That doesn't make any sense.
What the fuck are the odds? I was like, change your name.
That's insane that there's two people with that.
I know. I was like, man, I thought you were like my Twitter mutual, and you were just here being a good friend. No, I played myself. Never mind. I wish I didn't ask. I showed up late. What's up with those beans? Oh, I guess he caught up.
All right, so this has been good. I wasn't planning to go this long, but time flies when you're having fun.
That's true. Man, I came up with this handle in the 90s. Oh, I mentioned Vulpes, and he shows up. Well, that's fair. After meeting you in person, I can understand why you came up with it in the 90s.
You should put them in the same group chat. With this, I guess, Flemish guy.
Fortunately, the OGC Vulpes is also a cool dude. This is very true.
Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it.
Well, that is true. I saw your message, said Des. I thank you very much.
I'm tired of meeting cool guys.
I'm not. I like all the cool guys I meet from the internet.
I was expecting more freaks, and they're just not present. Even the guys who you think would be freaks, you meet them in real life, and they're like, hey, come here, I'm a hugger. We don't shake around here. Mr.
I'm waiting for that guy.
Mr. Hitleranus is my dad.
Please, please, please. Goebbels Groiper 97's my father.
I brought you a bag of corn. Everyone's coming with cool gifts, cool practical gifts that I would love. I got you a necklace of Amazon gift cards. I bought you a fucking rosary that doubles as a projectile. All cool stuff. I'm tired of cool stuff.
All right, guys. We'll see you next time.
All right. See you.